Good evening. Welcome to our distinguished panel on American national security, trade policy, and the Jones Act, a maritime law that governs who can access and who cannot access American ports. I'm personally thrilled to invite our speakers this evening to talk about issues that are at the top of all of our minds right now. We have experts and practitioners from the top echelons of the U.S. military, a former president of Puerto Rico's state senate and regional and global leader for the Americas, a trade and economics expert on shipping and other industries, and a student with international experience representing this university and our country abroad. I'll start off with introductions of our panelists. First, we have Paul Koffsky. Paul is a former senior deputy counsel of the Department of Defense who performed the duties of the Department of Defense General Counsel on multiple occasions. And if you can raise your hand so everyone can recognize you, thank you. Next, we have Colin Grabow, who is an associate director at the Cato's Institute Herbert Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, where his research focuses on domestic forms of trade protectionism, such as the Jones Act and the U.S. Sugar Program, and is the world's renowned expert on the Jones Act.
Yes, indeed.
Eduardo Batia is the John J. Weinberg Goldman Sachs and Company visiting professor and visiting lecturer in public and international affairs at Princeton University, just down the road, and chairman of the board for the Hispanic Information and Telecommunications Network, HITN. Batia previously served as the president of the Senate of Puerto Rico from 2013 to 2017, president of COPA, the Parliamentary Confederation of the Americas, and director of the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next, we have a senior at Stockton University, Camille Benoit. She is majoring in political science, international affairs with a global studies minor. She is president of our campus-wide Model UN program, where she serves in multiple roles, including volunteer staff for National Model United Nations, and she won Best Delegate at an international Model UN competition in Kobe, Japan. Welcome. And finally, we have our moderator, Rear Admiral Kevin Sweeney. Kevin Sweeney served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense James N. Mattis. He was responsible for providing counsel and advice to the Secretary on all matters concerning the department. In addition to his distinguished career in the Navy, he's also a board member for the Hughes Public Policy Center. To get us started, I'd like to invite to the podium our Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Mike Palladino.
Thank you, Dr. Zappilli. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our beautiful campus. Certainly on behalf of everyone in our academic community, it really is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion on American national security, trade policy, and the Jones Act. And after being in 2 days of board meetings and talking about things like $200 million of budget cuts for higher ed and things like that, I'm very pleased to be with you here tonight. So to Mr. Hughes, to Chairman Tolson, to our distinguished guests and panelists, including our wonderful student Camille Benoit, I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this important conversation, and we are very honored to have you here at the university. I'm certainly grateful to Dr. Zappilli and our wonderful team in the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy. If you're new to these conversations around Stockton University, we're certainly very proud of the leading organizing role that the Hughes Center has had and will continue to have in this region for bringing together thought and action leaders to engage our faculty, our students, our university community, in important conversations with significant local, regional, national, and international policy implications. So being immersed in Board of Trustees meetings the last couple days and then thinking about tonight's events, is there really anything controversial in the world right now about global economies, trade policy, or even national security and defense policies? Okay, so that's not a political statement, and that's said completely tongue-in-cheek, right, because this is obviously a very highly timely dialogue for many reasons. And in fact, I'm reminded of the importance of today's topic all the time. At the family dinner table, for example, with my brother-in-law, who is an executive for Maersk, the Danish shipping company. You may recognize, the audience may recognize those sky blue shipping containers that you see all around the country. And he frets about how to move cargo ships and materials all around the world, and the security of those ships and their risks, such as the Maersk Alabama, which he had to experience and live through, that was portrayed in the Captain Phillips movie. And Rear Admiral Sweeney, I had the pleasure of working under Vice Admiral Paul Gaffney, president of one of my prior institutions, who was the chief meteorologist for the Navy and oversaw the Naval Research Laboratories. And I share that because we would spend a lot of time talking about the critical intersections of oceans covering the vast surface of the Earth, and the importance of maritime policy for defense, for trade policy, for disaster preparedness and emergency responses, for climate change, for supply chain, for the good and products that Americans are so accustomed to having in our stores or delivered to our homes at a certain price. So I certainly know that for all of our students here, whether you're in the marine sciences, business, social sciences, the humanities, and others, this will be an insightful conversation. And to me, tonight's session truly speaks to something that is at the core of Stockton University's experience, and that is the blending of the liberal arts programs in interdisciplinary ways and with our professional programs. And so again, I want to emphasize the value of conversation and dialogue in forums such as tonight to bring experts together to help understand and solve community challenges. This really does speak beautifully to our teacher-scholar model at the university, where we have faculty who are subject matter experts doing research and scholarly work, not by excluding students, but side by side with our students, as evidenced tonight, as collaborators and colleagues. And so really tonight is a great example of this, as you'll see and hear. So thank you for listening. Welcome again. It's my pleasure to spend a few minutes with you on behalf of the university and enjoy tonight's conversation.
All right. My own background as the director of the Public Policy Center is in international relations and foreign policy. As our director, I've positioned us to address the intersection between the local, state, and national policy levels and the world system in which we live. It's true that all politics is local. What's happening in the rest of the world and our country's decisions about our role in the world impact us at the local level every day. Though it may not be obvious as we go about our lives, I think with the new president, we are seeing and questioning, again, how decisions about national security, trade, and other aspects of the economy, the bureaucracy, public servants, and other aspects of government are impacting us personally and are in our communities. This is a question we should continue to ask of ourselves, our elected officials, and the government workers tasked with developing and implementing policy. Their decisions impact us and those around us in this country and abroad. One of the biggest questions every country faces is this: to what extent should it protect itself against the risks of a global market, against national security risks? And to what extent should it cooperate in order to further advance human rights, economic development, as well as security? This is the central question in our global capitalist system. Every country makes its own choices about this balance between protection and cooperation. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. And what worked 40 or 50 years ago might not work the same for the single country today. Which brings me to the subject for this evening, the Jones Act. We're going to hear about how what might seem like a small piece of legislation or legislation that you might not have known about until this evening, how it was developed and how it impacts all of us in planned and in unexpected ways. And with that, I'll turn it over to tonight's moderator, Kevin Sweeney. Thank you.
All right, again, good evening, everybody, and Tina, thank you for the kind introduction. I do want to start again here with one, Camille, thank you for being on this panel. I am a member of the advisory board, and we are trying to involve the student body more and more in what the Policy Center does here. So Camille, first one up, and appreciate your participation. To my right here, Colin Grabow, as you heard, he is the national expert, perhaps the international expert. I think half the documents I read in preparation for this over the last couple of months were signed out somehow, written by or commented on by Colin, so it's been fabulous. To my left here, Paul Koffsky, recently retired after 45 years as a Department of Defense General Counsel at various levels. He not only provided legal but also prudential advice to, I think, 16 Secretaries of Defense. He was the General Counsel, performed the duties of the General Counsel in DOD in 2017 when Jim Mattis and I came into the Pentagon and just provided superb support. So we're fortunate to have what I consider a national treasure when it comes to national security law. And then lastly, and I'm thrilled, Eduardo, Senator, again, from right now up the street at Princeton, but more importantly, I think Eduardo could help us understand, I'm going to call the human impact or aspect for the people of Puerto Rico in particular, but just maybe as an example, the broader impacts across the country of the Jones Act, good and bad. And with that, I also like to thank the support of the Hughes family. I'm looking for Bill Hughes. He can't see
right here,
the
right
lights.
Here, right there.
But without that support, I don't think that the Hughes Center would be doing what it's doing. Rich Tolson, chairman of our advisory board, again, support there. Thank you very much. We were all up here speaking on our own behalf, if we will, representing ourselves, not representing either the organizations we work for now and or the previous employers that we all had. And lastly, it's a panel discussion. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation, not a debate. And most importantly, we're saving at least the last half hour or so for questions from you all as well. So with that, I'd like to start. But, you know, I'm originally from Philadelphia and driving up yesterday from Southern Virginia. It's kind of nice to listen to the radio, the local stations out of Philly. Then last night, watching a little bit of news, local stations. So, and then I saw these Eagles flags. So again, I'd like to give a little shout out to Philadelphia Eagles here. It's only been a month since the Eagles won the Super Bowl. I spent much of my time in Washington and Southern Virginia. Of course, all the TV down there is a team called the Washington Commanders, I think. But anyway, it's good to be home in a sense for me. I'm going to open up with Colin, and I'm going to ask Colin just to kind of give us initially a little 101 here on the Jones Act and perhaps why it was enacted and sort of how it's matured over the years and maybe a little bit of the impacts, and then we'll kind of go through each panelist once and then maybe one more time, then open up for questions here. But anyway, Colin, we, why the Jones Act for this crowd? It's not just South Jersey, but it's also really tri-state area. It includes the Port of Philadelphia, Philadelphia Shipyard, the facilities on Marcus Hook, offshore wind here in New Jersey is impacted perhaps, and a maritime industry in New Jersey itself. I saw somewhere in one of the articles ranked 11th in the country. So it does count here, and most people probably just aren't aware of what it means, how it does that.
Sure. Well, I'd like to begin by extending my thanks to Stockton University for inviting me to be here this evening. Thanks to you, Kevin, for moderating this discussion. So the Jones Act, let's first set the table. What is the Jones Act? What are we here to talk about tonight? The Jones Act is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which states essentially if you want to move goods by water within the United States, you have to use a vessel that meets 4 conditions. It has to be flagged and registered in the United States, it has to be built in the United States, it has to be crewed by Americans with some limited exceptions, it has to be at least 75% owned by Americans. Now, I suspect some people may hear that and think, okay, 1920, so pre-1920 was this laissez-faire free market environment, use whatever ship you wanted. And no, basically the Jones Act is just the latest iteration of cabotage laws, so restrictions on the use of foreign vessels in U.S. commerce. They go back to 1817, arguably back to the founding of the country in 1789. In fact, one of the first acts of Congress was placed duties on the use of foreign ships, said you can use a foreign ship, but they have to pay, I think, 50 cents per ton, and they have to pay it every time they go into port. Use an American ship, 6 cents per ton. So you could use a foreign ship, but from the reality was it was prohibitively costly to do so. And there was being forced to use an American ship was not that big of an imposition. American shipbuilders were some of the world's best, and this makes sense. This is the era of wooden ships, sail-powered. The United States, the 13 original states, basically lived along a huge forest. Ready supply of timber was available to build these ships. People lived along the water, knew all about shipbuilding, In fact, 1/3 of the British merchant fleet was built in the United States when the United States was a colony of the UK. So this speaks to our prowess in shipping and shipbuilding. Well, in 1817, the law gets changed and just says, no, it doesn't matter if you pay a duty, you're flatly prohibited from using foreign ships in domestic shipping. Well, again, not that big of an imposition, but times change. By the middle of the 1800s, the U.S. falls behind. This is the era of iron ships, steam-powered ships, and protected U.S. shipyards with their captive market did not keep up. So people started looking for ways around these laws. How can we avoid these kinds of restrictions? And they found one. And they said, well, I can't use a foreign ship between two U.S. ports, but what if I go to a foreign port, switch ships, go back to the U.S.? And you could do that. In fact, there was a court case about this, the famous, in my world, 250 kegs of nails case, where someone tried to ship 250 kegs of nails from the East Coast to California, and they did it through Belgium. Foreign ship to Belgium, transfer, another foreign ship to California. What's interesting here is they did the math. That made more sense financially than using an American ship. Well, Congress changed the law and said, okay, no, if it starts in the U.S., finishes in the U.S., has to go on an American ship. They still found another loophole, and this was in the Alaska trade, goods going to and from Alaska. So they couldn't take goods by water to a foreign port, but they could take it over land to a foreign port. And people did this. They take it up to Prince Rupert and Vancouver in British Columbia, and then on to Alaska or the reverse. Well, who hated this? Seattle-based shipping companies. They said, no, this should go through us. This is our trade. This is unfair foreign competition. And they had an ace up their sleeve in the form of Senator Wesley Jones of Washington State. So World War I comes along. The U.S. joins in April 1917. We don't have enough ships. We need to build ships. Hundreds of ships are ordered. In fact, one of the biggest shipyards in the country was built at Hog Island, which today I believe is where the Philadelphia International Airport is located. Most of these ships were delivered after the war was over. The government had a problem on its hands. What do we do with all these ships we just built? So Senator Jones has the idea, let's pass a Merchant Marine Act that will address the disposal of these ships and a whole bunch of other maritime-related issues. So they're having hearings about different aspects of U.S. maritime policy, and in February of 1920, a guy named William Clark of the Pacific Steamship Company shows up to testify before Congress, and he says, guys, we've got a problem. We have unfair foreign competition in the Alaska trade. Goods are going through Canada using foreign ships, not our ships. And we think if you take the existing law, make the following edits, tweaks, that'll solve the problem. And if you look at what's today the Jones Act, Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, it almost exactly resembles what William Clark of the Pacific Steamship Company proposed in Congress that day. And they put the kind of icing on the cake here. The Jones Act is passed in June of 1920. In August of 1920, Senator Jones goes to Tacoma, Washington, to defend this new Merchant Marine Act. Sitting right next to him on stage is none other than William Clark of the Pacific Steamship Company. And that's how we got the Jones Act. So what does the Jones Act do? Why am I so exercised about this law? Well, the Jones Act makes shipping in the United States incredibly expensive. This is inevitable. Again, I said you have to use a U.S. registered ship. U.S. registered ships flying the American flag are less than 1% of all the ships in the world. So right there, 99% of the ships off the table if you want to move goods within the United States. In fact, in terms of large ocean-going ships, there are only 93 in the entire world that comply with this law. That's 93 ships to meet the needs of the world's largest economy. And not just large in terms of GDP, it's just geographically vast. We live in a country that stretches from Guam to Puerto Rico, from the Aleutian Islands to Maine. Increasing the cost of transportation is no small thing. But on top of that U.S. flag requirement, it has to be built in the United States. That's an unusual requirement. And U.S.-built ships are incredibly expensive. In fact, just over this, I think 2 days ago, the Wall Street Journal had an article about the state of U.S. shipbuilding, which they called tiny and rusty. It gave the example of 3 ships being built at the Philly shipyard currently for an average price of $333 million. Points out if those ships were built in China, it'd be $55 million. That's a 6x difference. That's incredible. Then you have the operating costs. U.S. flag ships are over 4 times more expensive to operate than those from other countries. See, take all that together, and the inevitable result is incredibly expensive shipping. How expensive are we talking here? Well, in 2017, the CEO of Overseas Shipbuilding Group, which is the largest operator of Jones Act-compliant tanker vessels, So he admitted himself that a Jones Act ship is 3 to 4 times more expensive to use than one internationally flagged. And the article went on to say some shipping consultants say it's even higher. This is by their own admission. In 2012, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York did a study on how much it costs to ship goods from the East Coast to Puerto Rico. They did a hypothetical 20-foot container full of household items and commercial products. They found it cost twice as much, roughly $3,000, to send that to San Juan, Puerto Rico, as it is to neighboring Jamaica or the Dominican Republic, where the Jones Act does not apply. So we have, again, very expensive shipping. We've made it so expensive that although shipping is typically in the world considered a very efficient means of moving large quantities of goods over long distances, and we have lots of, again, we live in a big country, we barely use it. According to the Congressional Research Service, as of 2019, only 2% of our freight is used that goes by ship. And that's pretty incredible when you think about U.S. geography, not just the distances. We have thousands of miles of coastline, home to major population centers. We have the non-contiguous states and territories like Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, where basically you have either ship or airplane. And then we have this amazing system of rivers. We have the Great Lakes. And yet all waterborne commerce in terms of ton miles, which is the appropriate metric for measuring how much freight gets moved in the country, water accounts for, and we're including barges, everything here, I think 8.7% last I checked. That's incredible. We've taken what should be an incredibly efficient means of moving goods and made it an option of last resort. In fact, those 93 ships I mentioned, where are they employed? Well, about half of them, all the container ships, are used to serve Guam, Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii, where you have no other option. And the tankers are all used to serve those areas of the country where we don't have pipelines or we are pipeline constrained. So for example, taking Alaskan oil to refineries on the West Coast or transporting gasoline refined products from the Gulf Coast to Florida, which is not connected to our system of pipelines. These are the costs. What are the effects? How does this manifest itself in our economy? We've made shipping so expensive in this country that Hawaii imports oil. They use light sweet oil, which is what Texas has in abundance, but they buy from Libya instead, which is 4,000 miles farther away than Texas is. Because once you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make any sense to buy American. We have examples of timber producers in Northwest, in Washington and Oregon. And they say that they're a competitive disadvantage. They want to ship timber to the rest of the U.S., but they have their competitors over across the board in Canada. They can ship theirs internationally flagged carriers, very efficient, but they're stuck with Jones Act. Once you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make any sense. We even have extreme examples where it's not just more expensive to buy American, you can't buy American. We are the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas. New England imports LNG from Trinidad and Tobago and other places because there are 0 Jones Act compliant liquefied natural gas tankers to transport it from U.S. ports. We are the world's 3rd leading exporter of liquefied petroleum gas, which is basically propane. Hawaii buys it from West Africa instead of from the U.S. Same with Puerto Rico. They can't get it because there are no ships to transport it. This is lunacy. We have examples of agricultural products. People farmers in North Carolina buying imports from Brazil instead of from the Midwest, because again, you factor in the cost of transportation. So on the one hand, we can talk about, yes, it costs X amount more to send a good on a Jones Act compliant ship than international, but really the cost of the Jones Act is very much an opportunity cost. It's what does the United States look like with the Jones Act in place versus what does the United States look like without the Jones Act in place? Think about all the efficiencies that could be brought to bear. Think about our steel industry that we talk so much about. We slap tariffs on foreign steel to try to boost the U.S. steel industry. How about we give U.S. steel access to efficient transportation? There's one government study that asked the question, why are Western states buying so much imported steel instead of from the eastern U.S. steel mills? Well, one answer that repeatedly was highlighted in the report was the Jones Act, the cost of transportation. And it's not just on the sales side, and the production side. Some of the U.S.'s most efficient steel mills use scrap metal as an input. We are the world's leading exporter of scrap metal. But according to the steel industry testimony for Congress, it's cheaper to send scrap metal from a U.S. port to China or to Turkey than to another American port. This is crazy. So this, I could go on and on, but I think I'll stop here. I think you get the point.
We got a little excited in the green room earlier tonight as well. Okay, so the Jones Act, we heard sort of the economic input, sort of the maturation of the Jones Act over years. But Paul, I'm almost embarrassed to say, I spent 32 plus years in the Navy, and from a naval perspective, maritime perspective, we never had an issue because of the Jones Act, obviously building Navy ships and supporting Navy ships in our ports. In 2017, we were in the Pentagon, and that summer we had hurricanes down in the Caribbean. Ultimately, Puerto Rico paid a price, and the issue came up for the first time for me as Chief of Staff at the Pentagon, and trying to figure out the petition, working for a waiver, and how we're more important just going to respond to the crisis happening down in Puerto Rico. So, Paul, let me go to you. There is a national security aspect to the Jones Act and the importance of the Jones Act from a national security perspective. There are waivers to deal with it, but if you can give us just a little background, perhaps on, at the end of the day, it's been 100 plus years. Bipartisan support, ironically, for a law that, from an economic perspective, doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet. We haven't seen it repealed, and we'll talk about maybe some ways to improve it here at the end. But if you let's just talk a little bit about what we care about from a national security perspective, and just why there's such focus on it.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be here at Stockton University, and especially to appear with such a distinguished panel. In particular, Kevin Sweeney, who was the best Chief of Staff to the best Secretary of Defense in the history of the department. So thank you very much. As Colin mentioned, when Senator Jones put forth what became Section 27 of the Maritime Act, oftentimes referred to as the Jones Act, in 1920, he had two rationales. The first was national defense, national security. How do we secure the nation's need for adequate ocean-going vessels in time of war or other national crisis? And the other rationale was to prop up, to support, to give in effect a monopoly to shipping coming to and from the port of Seattle, Washington. Over time, the second rationale probably has been much more important, at least politically, than the first rationale. But with respect to the first rationale, the idea of the Jones Act, and for those who support the Jones Act, is that the Department of Defense, the nation, needs an adequate merchant marine to support the delivery of materiel and warfighters to war zones, and we need it immediately when the crisis arises, and furthermore, that it's essential that we be able to rely upon the integrity of those owning the ships, those operating the ships, those crewing the ships. And the best way to do that is to have a system whereby those ships are U.S. citizen-owned, U.S. flagged, crewed by a master and officers who are U.S. citizens, and 75% of the remaining crew are U.S. citizens. And most significantly, the ship has to be built in the United States. The Jones Act, like many statutes, leaves the details to the executive branch. And the executive branch fleshes out those details through a system of regulations issued by the U.S. Coast Guard and the Customs and Border Patrol element of the department. Both are elements of the Department of Homeland Security. Those regulations are, in many respects, quite strict and lead to the situation that Colin has so ably laid out today. So when we were dealing with the crises in the Caribbean in 27, Kevin, the Secretary of Defense did issue waivers to the Jones Act. That is permitted by Section 501A of Title 46 of the United States Code. And I'm a lawyer, but I promise I'm not going to get legalistic with you. I'm a recovering lawyer. I'm retired. So bear with me. I have to get a little legalistic. The Secretary of Defense is unique under the Jones Act and related statutes in that if the Secretary determines that there's an urgent requirement for national defense, the Secretary may request a waiver of the Department of Homeland Security. The word request is kind of odd there because under the law, if the Secretary requests a waiver, Homeland Security must grant that waiver. Now, I checked with some former colleagues in the department a week ago about the history of waivers and was told that while there are no really terrific data, the best data they have is over the last 30 years, the Secretary has only asked for 8 waivers, 2 of which were directed by the White House in response to the hurricanes in 2017. So essentially 6 waivers over 30 years at the Defense Department's initiative. You can play those statistics, any way you want. You could say, look, the Jones Act really isn't that much of an impediment to national defense because the Secretary only asked for 6 waivers. Or you can say, perhaps, that the national defense rationale for the Jones Act isn't as strong as it was in 1920 or 1941 to 1945 or the 1950s during the Korean conflict, because we don't deliver soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and Coast Guardsmen, and I should add, I guess now Guardians, the Space Force, by ship anymore. We deliver them by air. And in fact, in the weeks that it would take to deliver troops by ship, very often these conflicts would be over. So that rationale has gone away. And we still need to deliver materiel by ships, but we have only, by rough estimates, 3,800 U.S. mariners serving the Merchant Marine. Has the Jones Act really accomplished its objective to secure national defense with such a small Merchant Marine? And Colin has also ably laid out the costs of U.S.-built vessels. Astronomical, at least 4 and perhaps 6 times as much as a foreign country would charge to build a vessel. And that means that we have a very small supply of vessels, under 80, many of which have far exceeded their useful life of 20 years. So in the national defense sphere, it is, again, speaking only for myself, it is hard to justify the Jones Act. And then when you look at, and we also have a national security interest in securing an adequate, a good standard of living for our fellow citizens in non-contiguous areas, Puerto Rico, Guam, Alaska, and Hawaii. And the effect of the Jones Act is to drive up prices dramatically in those areas. That has an impact on our fellow citizens that is hard to reconcile given the rather dubious benefits that the Jones Act provides.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Senator Eduardo, again, welcome. And
thank you.
So for us, for me in particular, the focal point was 2017 and moving forward. But given your experience in government leadership within Puerto Rico, now here up at Princeton in New Jersey, can you kind of give us a little feel for sort of what you've been working towards for many, many years and what the government of Puerto Rico cares about, and maybe why it's failed? I mean, quite frankly, why, like I said, after 100 plus years, it is a bipartisan law in the sense that no one's really worked hard to change it / repeal it. And we'll talk more about that, but go ahead if you would, Eduardo.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stockton University. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, the center, for having us here. Tina, thank you so much for having us here. Provost, who's here, thank you so much. It's perhaps a new subject for many of you. It's, the first time you're hearing about this, this law that no one knows about. We live with this in Puerto Rico. We live with this every day. If, let's say, Camille, for example, who's finishing her senior year here, wants to start a business next year, And one of her markets, huge market, by the way, Puerto Rico's market for the United States is bigger than the market of Brazil. There are 3 million people in Brazil, in Puerto Rico. There are 212 million people in Brazil. And Puerto Rico buys more goods from the United States than all of Brazil, which is amazing. I mean, think about it. That means that many goods in Puerto Rico are certainly, manufactured in the U.S. Now, Camille wants to start her store and wants to send some T-shirts down to, she wants to, and her friends want to do a business for T-shirts. And I think Colin said something that is really important. She basically goes and fills up a whole container. It's $3,000 to send a container down to Puerto Rico. But the same container for the Dominican Republic next door, I mean, you can see the Dominican Republic, it's $1,500. It's 50% of the price. So what does that mean? If you want to sell her T-shirts down in Puerto Rico, you have to pay a higher price. So now we have kind of a self-induced inflation for goods that come from the United States. The reason why prices are so high in the jurisdiction that is by far the poorest jurisdiction within the United States, we have higher prices because of a law that is supposed to defend and protect the national security of the United States. And I honestly think it's yes, we all have to pay our fair share to defend and protect the United States, but is it really doing that? And I would question, my question would be, I am all for protecting the national security, especially these days, but that law is not doing that. That law is simply protecting a very inefficient industry in the United States. And you would say, why aren't our ships in the United States competing better with other ships in, around the world? And the reason, there are many reasons for it, many reasons, but suffice to say that for us in Puerto Rico, the way it looks is it's like our ships cannot compete because of price. I mean, look at the ships from South Korea, from Hong Kong, from countries all over the world. Taiwan actually has a fleet of ships that it's much cheaper than the United States. So the question is, if you're going to have a free market, should we be protecting the ships of the United States, or should we actually allowing for cheaper goods, for cheaper transportation to take place? Now, I'll give you two quick examples. I don't want to take a lot of your time. I want to hear your questions. But yes, in 2017, we had a hurricane, huge hurricane, Hurricane Maria. You remember? So some people in Puerto Rico did not have electricity for about a year. I mean, think about it, not having electricity for a year. It's the longest blackout ever in United States territory. Now, we had some of our generators, our LNG generators, have been transformed from oil, very expensive oil, now to cheaper LNG. Now, the issue is, Dominican Republic went through the same hurricane, right? They're next door. Dominican Republic can buy LNG from Houston, from Texas, from Louisiana, from Mississippi, and we cannot. Why? Because there are no ships built in the United States that transport LNG in the last 50 years. So we're there kind of crossing our arms saying, how come they get the gas to get the electricity? These are U.S. citizens. Now, to give you the example, taking it away for a minute from Puerto Rico, Hawaii was buying gas from Russia. Now, once Russia invaded Ukraine, Hawaiians were saying, what are we going to buy? We cannot buy. People who are not U.S. citizens can buy gas from the United States, and U.S. citizens cannot. How absurd is that law? That makes absolutely no sense. So I think to the extent that we live with it, that we have to face it every day, that we have to actually knock on every door that we can. Colin knows how much, we have been knocking on doors throughout Washington, and it's just one of those things where it is the only public policy issue that I have ever looked at, where you have the shipyard owners on the one hand saying, no, no, don't change the law, you're protecting my ships. And you have the U.S. labor unions, the left, the Democrats and the Republicans are united not to change the law because they protect, on the one hand, the ship owners, the shipyard owners, and on the other hand, the labor unions. The net effect is that our shipping industry is not competitive, that we're not really protecting the national security, and that overall what we're really doing is keeping a whole fleet of very outdated ships that should be just taken out, and we should sort of renew our whole shipping industry in the United States. Again, from my perspective, and I'll finish with this, I'll just wrap it up with this, other than national security, we should also see how this law is having an enormous impact on the poorest segment, poorest jurisdiction within the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo. So Camille, you and I spoke earlier, and if you could just give a little perspective, this is obviously brand new to you, and you did a little homework and a little research, and with the focus of, again, maybe a regional perspective here, South Jersey, Mid-Atlantic region, certain Philadelphia area, just kind of talk us through a little bit of kind of what you learned and what you just heard tonight, what maybe concerns you, and then we'll ultimately kind of talk about, okay, what do we do? Whether we like it or not, this is where we're at, and we'll talk about kind of what do we do, perhaps.
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of people my age would not know anything about this. I think I may have heard of it when I was in AP US history classes, and that was like a clause somewhere that you would regurgitate, but you wouldn't actually know the implications of it. I think it kind of highlights a broader problem within education of not knowing the implications of our economic system that exists within the United States and not having any real education beyond that. I think we talked about that this morning too with civics education. Economics education kind of goes hand in hand with that as well. So down here in South Jersey, obviously, as you mentioned, we're near the Philadelphia ports. We have a large fisheries industry. We have offshore windmills being debated, and you said that there was something in it within the Merchant Maritime Law too that could kind of be used within that debate. I think that we don't have a lot of understanding of how this impacts us, and I've had no clue how much it impacts our industries within the United States for being able to ship. I work in business outside of here. All the time we're looking for efficiency and the cheapest price in the bid, so there is implications way broader than what you could ever imagine, and I think that it would be important I think the reason why we don't always see a lot of discussion on it is because you don't understand, like I said, the implications of it at all. Maybe that would be something that could change and that would, light a fire, but without people knowing, it kind of leads to a complacency thing, and that's why there might not be anything done with it at points.
Thank you, Camille. So, Colin, if you could talk a little bit about the reality is we do have a shipbuilding industry, perhaps it's focused on tugs and barges and coastal movements and not the international trade side. And certainly if we repealed the Jones Act, we would not overnight change the shipbuilding capabilities here in the U.S., and that's driven, I would say, primarily by a skilled labor force versus even facilities as we deal with those issues just on building on Navy ships and Coast Guard and other military requirements. But at the end of the day here, I'm also by profession on the board of directors of a ship repair company down in Norfolk, Virginia. Longest continuous operating shipyard in the United States, family owned, 150 years old, celebrating that anniversary this year. About 60% of our work, I guess, is with the military, government, and then about 40% commercial. We do have 3 major commercial shipbuilding facilities here in the U.S., NASCO, Philly, and a couple of facilities down in the Gulf region. That's real jobs. I mean, those are real jobs, and if it's not a fabric that's good enough, in a sense, for national security, if things go south, if you will, but they're real jobs, they're real facilities, they're real capabilities. And then we had a little bit of a jolt coming out of COVID, and the supply chain, the reliability of the supply chain, the focus on building in America, buying America, if you will, the vulnerability if something happens, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, and trade does stop with say, China, cold, all of a sudden, even the options that are there now for anybody in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, or elsewhere, those options may go away fairly quickly. So, sort of the state of play is in fact what we have today, and certainly the justifications make sense for change, immediate change, rapid change. But really, how do we move the chess piece here? Like I said, 100+ years, as Eduardo commented, truly a bipartisan support for different reasons. But just talk me through that a little bit, how we do move forward, recognizing in particular the vulnerabilities we have on the national security side, even if inadequate.
So with regard to shipbuilding, you brought up the issue of supply chain security. The fact that we want to be able to rely on Americans, maybe, foreigners, that's a little dangerous. Let's assume that premise for a second. Let's assume that's all true and that there's a great virtue in being self-reliant and not having to turn to foreigners. If you adopt that mentality, I think the Jones Act totally fails. Because let's talk about these U.S.-built ships. What is a U.S.-built ship? Well, to be considered U.S.-built, it means that the superstructure and the hull of the ship have to be assembled in the United States. The watertight envelope of the ship has to be produced here. But what about what goes in the ship? All the components, the engine, the propeller, the anchors, all the machinery that makes the ship work. That can all be foreign, and it all is foreign. Back in 2009, Philly Shipyard built some tankers called the Veteran-class tankers. Each one of those tankers required 500 containers worth of material from South Korea, plus another 25 shipments of things like the engine and the propeller, the things that actually make the ship work. These U.S.-built ships are U.S. assembled, heavily reliant on foreign components. Don't take my word for it. According to the U.S. Maritime Administration, they posted a transcript of a discussion with an executive from the Philly Shipyard. And according to him, there are roughly 1 million parts and components in a ship, and at least half of them are imported. That's 500,000 parts and components that are imported. So even if, worst case scenario, God forbid, we find ourselves in time of conflict, don't operate under the illusion that all of a sudden, hey, it's okay, we can build our own ships because we're not beholden to foreign supply chains. Oh yes, we very much are. I'll also tell you, not only the parts and components, even some of the labor is foreign. For example, Philly Shipyard, when it comes time to install an engine, they will fly over technicians from South Korea to do the installations. And you think, well, why would they do that? Well, folks, when you're only building one ship a year, you don't need to keep people on staff that all they do is specialize in engine installation. It makes sense to bring in the folks from South Korea who do this routinely from shipyards that build 50, 60 ships a year to do that. So we get all the downside, the high costs, but the notion that it's okay, we're self-reliant, that's the total fiction. We can talk about shipbuilding more broadly. There might be a good argument for the Jones Act if you said, well, in exchange for these high costs, hey, we have this great shipbuilding industry, which has obvious utility for the U.S. military in times of war to build and repair ships. Except in 2023, which is the most recent year for which we have data, U.S. commercial shipbuilding accounted for 0.1% of global output. That's not some weird anomaly. Going back over the last decade, the U.S. has bounced between 0.5% and 0.05%. So that's where we are. In 2023, we were basically roughly on par with Iran. I think we were 14th in the world, Iran was 15th, and the difference was like this. So, the entire, U.S. shipbuilding industry today, their order book consists of, I think, 4 ships in the entire country. Over the last 25 years, in an average year, all U.S. shipyards combined build about 3 large ocean-going commercial ships. So, Matt, you mentioned some of the shipyards that we do have. So you have to think to yourself, well, Colin, we have Newport News, we have lots of big shipyards in this country. How do you reconcile this? This is because the reality of U.S. shipbuilding is that it's overwhelmingly driven by government contracts, by naval construction. As of, I think, 2019, which is the most recent data I'm aware of, government revenue accounted for, or government contracts accounted for 78.6% of shipbuilding and repair industry revenue. Kevin, you brought up the repair side. Well, I'm just going to float the idea here. If we got rid of the Jones Act and we could have more shipping going between U.S. ports, that would mean more repair opportunities, which I think would be valuable. So I think, from a national security perspective, if we want to have a robust, modern shipbuilding industrial complex, we know that, this path doesn't work. And don't take my word for it, being the, dyed-in-the-wool libertarian over at Cato Institute. Just think about, what others say. The Wall Street Journal, 2 days ago, I mentioned they refer to the U.S. shipbuilding industry as tiny and rusty. The Government Accountability Office had a report released last Thursday, and it said that U.S. shipbuilding, commercial shipbuilding, is in a state of near total collapse. That's their words, not mine. So this is the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, speaking a few months ago, was discussing the state of U.S. shipbuilding. He said, you go to some of our shipyards, they look like they're from the 1930s. Again, his words, not mine. So I would say, and I would just submit to you, this is incredible. When you think about, we live in the world's most advanced, most innovative, dynamic economy. We are a manufacturing powerhouse. We're the world's second largest manufacturer. And yet, when it comes to shipbuilding, we are just an also-ran. I mean, 0.1%. How much lower can you get? The bar has been set so low, I can't help but think that if not for this law, we'd have a more robust industry than what we have. Again, the bar has been set just that low.
Paul, as you mentioned earlier, legal issues, policy, laws, being in D.C. for all these years. So we talk about this, how do we be a catalyst of change? How do we at DOD even become a catalyst of change, perhaps? We have a new administration. I don't think the policies have been set yet. There's been some indications. But talk us through a little bit the reality of why things haven't changed, and perhaps how do we at least move this along a little bit?
Change is difficult. I think we all can agree at that. And when a law has been in effect for 105 years and has very powerful supporters, it's even more difficult to effect change in that law. So there are several ways that one could go about addressing the problem that is the Jones Act. One is to attempt a flat-out repeal. In my judgment, that's probably not likely to succeed. As the senator pointed out, there are many powerful supporters of the Jones Act for different reasons on both sides of the political spectrum. In fact, it's probably one of the few issues in Washington today where you can get some consensus, unfortunately, but some consensus. So there are several ways that this can be approached. One is, let me put my lawyer hat on just briefly, just very briefly, and bear with me. We have a law that is written in very broad terms, and that's not unusual. In fact, it's typical for legislation, especially legislation that was passed 100 years ago. Lately, legislation is oftentimes a little more detailed. And it talks in very broad terms, and Colin has referred to some of those terms. The requirement that a ship be U.S. built. The law just says the ship has to be U.S. built, and then the executive branch fills in the gaps. It says, what does that mean? And those regulations can be tweaked, can be liberalized in such a way as to allow more than half of the components of a ship. And thank you, I learned something. I didn't know there were 1 million components to a ship. That's pretty awesome. But maybe only 500,000 today are produced domestically. The law could be revised. In particular, the requirement that a certain amount of steel by weight be in the ship could be increased to allow foreign steel. Some of the components of the ship could be allowed to be constructed by foreign entities, by non-U.S. entities. That would require what we call a rulemaking by the Department of Homeland Security. It's a long process. It could take a year or more, but it's a whole lot shorter than the possibility of gaining statutory relief. Another possibility are some amendments to the Jones Act offered by members of Congress from Guam and Hawaii, two of the non-contiguous jurisdictions that, along with Puerto Rico and Alaska, are most affected by the Jones Act, most affected adversely. And these would do some things that I think would ameliorate the Jones Act effects on the non-contiguous jurisdictions. One proposal would be simply to repeal the Jones Act with respect to the non-contiguous jurisdictions. The other two proposals wouldn't go quite as far, but they would help in some ways. The second proposal would redefine the term reasonable rate which domestic shippers may charge so that no more than 10% above the international shipping rates for companies would be allowed. And the third would provide that whenever there's a monopoly or a duopoly with respect to shipping to a non-contiguous area, the Jones Act would not apply. And in Hawaii, for example, there's a duopoly. Two companies dominate the market. Another possibility is to appeal, just as the Jones Act supporters appeal to various interests, the Jones Act antagonists could appeal to various interests. There are environmental impacts from the Jones Act. To the extent that we're not shipping goods by water, we're shipping them by rail and by trucking. And both rail and trucking have many more serious and detrimental impacts on the environment than shipping by water. So maybe environmentalists would be interested. For those who are concerned about free trade, and that may not be all that popular these days in some quarters, but to the extent that people are concerned about free trade, repealing portions or modifying the Jones Act might be attractive. Now, in Congress today, and for some years, legislation is rarely passed specifically on one subject. You have broad bills, omnibus bills, that include many, many different provisions, many of them unrelated to the others. And so rather than proposing either repeal, which in my judgment is not likely today, or significant amendments, which in my judgment are more likely today, rather than proposing them as freestanding legislation, it might be worthwhile considering attaching them to veto-proof bills, to bills that must pass. And I'm thinking now of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is yay thick some years. And so just a few sentences in addition would cure some of the problems of the Jones Act. How to do that? Perhaps the way to do that is in conference, where legislators at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the senator knows more about this than I, are trying to reach compromise in a hurry, and something like this might be attractive to them at 2 o'clock in the morning, just to get on to the issues that have more popular appeal. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, that's good. It's called realism, I think, in D.C., good or bad. I'd like to go ahead, Tina, and transition to questions here from everybody sitting in front of us. But I would hope one of you ask about offshore wind and sort of how is the Jones Act being applied today to offshore wind, whether it's off Jersey, Virginia, up in New England, and kind of the thought process a little bit about that. I'll just want to go ahead, though, and give the opportunity for folks to ask questions, Tina.
All right, so please raise your hand and I'll come to you with a microphone. If you could say your name, your hometown, and your question.
Hi, I'm Bob Goodale. I live down here in Cumberland County. Bill Hughes Jr. and I met while I was in prison. I was working there, but we worked on a campaign. I didn't know if you knew, but Dorchester is in Cumberland County, right around the corner from here. And it used to be the largest shipbuilder in the 1700s anywhere in the world. I hear they clear-cut most of the trees down here, so we're familiar with shipping a little bit, if you're old enough. They're also the biggest bootleggers of rum. By the way, the oyster boats would sneak rum in at night when it was illegal. So, but I was wondering, nobody talked about tariffs, and I don't understand it. I'll just be disclose that I watch most of the shows on TV that are against the tariffs right now. I don't know if that's what that says, but so would it make sense, and why are American ships so expensive? Is it because labor unions get paid better, and in order to make it more even, we got to pay them poverty wages like China does? Or, you know, why is it like that? And then would tariffs help? So if somebody wants to compete with us from wherever, no problem, pay us, and we'll apply that money towards the industry so it's less expensive to build the ships and operate them. I'm probably not making any sense, I'm sorry, but that's what I was confused about.
That's a great question, Bob. Colin, you want to jump in a little bit? Sure. I mean, obviously, tariffs kicked in yesterday to two of our partners, trading partners, and you know, whether they're long-term or short-term, we don't know yet. Maybe we'll hear later on tonight. But what is the impact, I guess, Colin, quite frankly, of kind of a shift in how we are dealing with some of our largest partners in trade?
Well, I'll get to your question about, I think you raise a very good question and a pretty logical question. People think, why are US-built ships so expensive? I mean, we can build airplanes competitively. We have a pretty sizable auto industry. Why are US-built ships so absurdly expensive, so far outside the international norm? And I would submit that the Jones Act is at least partially culpable for this. So let me eliminate one explanation. It is not because Americans are paid so much and foreigners are not. In fact, I referenced a GAO study that was released on Thursday. They talked about the shipbuilding industrial base, and the shipyard said, yeah, we can't hire workers. We're losing them out to Uber. We're losing them out to fast food restaurants and other service jobs, okay? Internationally, there was, you referenced the NASCO shipyard earlier, which is, for those unfamiliar, the biggest shipyard on the West Coast. They put out a report in, I think, 2009 or so that had a chart of different shipbuilding countries and the average wage they are paid. The US was second lowest. Only China was cheaper. South Korea, more. Germany, more. Japan, more. So it's not wages. It just reflects that US companies or shipbuilders are just that inefficient. In fact, I recall that some US shipyard executives said that their foreign competitors, I shouldn't say competitors because they don't really compete with them, but foreign counterparts sell their ships for less than what Americans pay just for the steel. In many ways, shipbuilding it centers around economies of scale. And so if you're a US shipyard and you're building, you know, US shipbuilding industry, you know, collectively, if they build 3 ships a year, again, keep in mind that a single shipyard in South Korea can build 50 ships a year. So if you're building 50 versus 1, 2, 3, think about the differences. Shipbuilding involves extremely high capital costs. You have to build cranes, large pieces of equipment to put these ships together, assemble them. Well, if you're spreading those costs over 50 ships a year, that's one thing. If you're spreading those costs over a handful of ships a year, that's something completely different. Think about when you go to order steel for those ships. You can say, yeah, I need enough steel to build 2 ships. Okay, you're going to get one price from the steel mill. You say, I'm building 50 ships. You're getting a very different price from that steel mill. Same thing with engines. Every type of component, you know, the kind of price you're able to get. There's also learning by doing. I mentioned the Philly shipyard is currently, they have an order for 3 ships, average price of $333 million a piece. But the first ship cost $355 million. I believe the second one cost $322, and the one after that $321, because ship costs they lower the more ships you build, because you learn lessons from the first ship, apply those to the second ship, so on and so forth. Well, Americans, you know, you'll get an order for 2 ships. at the very most 4 ships. I mean, overseas you can get order for 12 ships or more. So this has an effect. There's less specialization in the United States. Overseas, different shipyards tend to specialize in certain types of vessels. Turkey, for example, they're world-class in building tugboats. Finland has built 60% of the world's icebreakers. They've designed 80% of them. The Dutch, dredging vessels. South Korea, very good at liquefied natural gas carriers. The Chinese, bulk carriers, container ships. And Americans, we're good at maybe river barges. We're kind of jack of trade and master of none. We build this, we build that. We're kind of all over the place. We don't specialize. If you want to be competitive in shipbuilding, you need to build large volumes for a certain segment. Find your competitive niche, get really good at it, and sell to the world market. So you can get those volumes, those economies of scale. And the Jones Act totally disincentivizes that. We're oriented towards a captive domestic market instead of the large international market. And so I mentioned we're at 0.1%. I think the outcome has been self-evidently negative. This has not worked. So that gets to why, it's not a complete explanation, but that I think gets you a large distance of the reason to why we're so uncompetitive. Let me also point out that we're not just uncompetitive against China or low Chinese wages. We can't keep up with the Dutch or the Norwegians, okay? Nobody's building vessels there to take advantage of the low wages. So it just reflects low productivity. You mentioned tariffs. Could we tariff foreign ships and maybe take that money, apply it towards the U.S. shipbuilding industry? 2 things about that. Right now, we have basically an infinite tariff. It's a complete prohibition. Moving to a tariff model would be an improvement. You could set that tariff very high, 300-400%, to put U.S.-built ships on even keel. With foreign-built ships. One thing we've talked about reform earlier. What are some ideas? One possibility is we shift towards a tariff and say you can use a foreign ship, but you got to pay a tariff, and then set it at a very high rate, 400%, and then say every year it'll go down 10-20% until eventually you get to a place where you're on your own. Try to smooth out that transition process so shipbuilders can get time to prepare. You could give them, say, a big government contract to recapitalize our sea lift fleet. The average age of the U.S. sea lift fleet, these are government-owned ships that are used in times of war to transport supplies and equipment for our military. Last I checked, the average age was around 45. Internationally, ships are considered old at 15 to 20 years of age. So you could, again, set up a tariff. You could give a big contract and say you need to recapitalize our fleet. There's a lot of business, but know that when this runs out and the tariffs run out, you're going to be on your own. It's sink or swim time. You guys got to step up your game a bit. So I think those are some of the possibly, creative approaches we could take to try to move towards a more liberalized cabotage law.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Hi, Tim Axelson, born and raised in Cape May, commercial fishing, live in Galloway right now. 15 years ago, I joined the offshore wind industry here with a local company called Fisherman's Energy. We were going to build 5 turbines off Atlantic City, but it never went through. Anyway, I've still made a career out of working in offshore wind. But I went to one of the maritime colleges, the New York Maritime College in '82. My father, my 2 uncles, my brother, me, my son, my nephew. Anyway, tale of two careers. My brother sailed Jones Act his whole career. I sailed oil and gas. You go to work for the person that hires you when you get out of college. I was hired by an oil and gas company out of Texas that had a whole fleet of offshore drilling vessels. None of them built in America. I sailed under Bahamian flag, Panamanian flag, Libyan flag, Liberian flag, not Libyan. But anyway, you get the picture. So when I finally came back into the offshore wind industry, it's Jones Act applicable, of course. Transportation of merchandise kicks in. If you're going to haul people out to a wind farm, you're going to haul material out to a wind farm, has to be subject to the Jones Act, not necessarily to construction assets. Make a long story short, I work for a company now in the offshore wind business that has a new vertical, and they're a shipping company out on Long Island for 38 years with a fleet of ocean-going vessels, U.S. flag, U.S. mariners, U.S. unions. Never built one of the ships here. Our first Jones Act qualified vessel was a 90-foot aluminum high-speed catamaran built in Massachusetts. It's now working on the Vineyard Wind project. Twice as much and took more than twice as long to get it built. That is the problem. And then we're looking at building larger ships, deck carriers, other ships that can feed this offshore wind industry offshore. You go to the yards and try to get pricing, and you can't get them interested at all. They love their government work. They love their government contracts. They like working with the taxpayer because the taxpayer never complains, right? Cost overruns, late delivery. They're signing contracts with no delivery date. I read in Marine Log one time. I couldn't believe I even read that. You're getting contracts from the government with no delivery date? IDIQ on shipbuilding? I mean, no wonder they don't want to build commercial vessels. So this is kind of the problem that's happened in U.S. shipbuilding. And I'm not talking about the small mom and pop yards. They're always going to be there. We have a huge brown water fleet that's Jones Act for the oil and gas industry. They build supply vessels, tugs, barges. But the blue water fleet, yeah, it's a huge cost of capital, and you can't compete. And so our ships, some of our ships in my company are entered into the maritime security program because we do a lot of business with the Defense Department. With our RoRos, we haul food aid with the grain with our bulkers. So we're very familiar with how that industry works, how it got to where it is today. You ask people in my industry, they blame the U.S. Navy and say it's their problem. The procurement of the government procurement of shipbuilding disincentivizes them to be competitive, period. And so I don't know how to solve the problem. I don't have a solution here. I hear what you're all saying up on the Diaz there. I'm an American sailor. My son's a sailor with OSG. My nephew works for Maersk. I mean, they're all sailors in unions. So I don't know what the answer is to the solution, but I know something's got to be done. That's for darn sure, because continuing to build, you can't compete. Once you build a ship for this market, you cannot use that ship anywhere else, because you cannot compete with everybody else that's building ships at half the cost. You just cannot compete. I don't care how many tariffs or subsidies you have. It's the deployed capital cost to build it. And then you may miss the market because you're 2 years late making the market with the ship you're having built. That Great Lakes rock dumper up there at Philly Shipyard that's being built right now, they're missing the market. That client they built that ship for is now going to have to use a foreign flag vessel to dump those rocks because that ship is built late. They're missing the opportunity. So I don't know what the answer is here, but I've been in this business my entire life. And oh, by the way, my grandfather's first fishing boat was built at Stoneman's Boat Yard in Dorchester. Anyway, sorry, I don't have a question here, but I'm living the reality of what this is and what you're talking about on that Diaz. So I'm living the reality. Sorry.
Thank you.
Well, Tim, thanks for the background. And I think that's actually very insightful in the sense that a local family, is in the maritime industry, the various options within the maritime industry, and so the impact. And I think Colin has certainly a comment to the non-answer, to the non-question.
Well, I'd like to thank you for that, because these are exactly the sorts of conversations that we should be having. I suspect that you and I sat down, there'll probably be a fair number of things we disagree about, but we agree that there's a problem. And unfortunately, too much of the current conversation is premised on, no, Jones Act is working out great, just keep it in place. No, this is unacceptable. I mean, you made a few excellent points. I mentioned cost, I emphasize that, but the time of construction. So currently, give you real life, you gave an example yourself, the rock dumper. So currently, Philly Shipyard has on its order book a vessel that is designed to install rocks at the base of the offshore wind turbines to provide scour protection and stability. This vessel was ordered in 2021, I believe. It was scheduled for delivery, I think, originally in 2024. The original price was $197 million. The price has now gone up to $246 million. Great Lakes Dock and Dredge that ordered the vessel is suing Philly Shipyard because they're so delayed on delivery, which is now projected for September of 26. So that's right, and this is a recurring theme. There's also one offshore wind turbine installation vessel, because currently, what was mentioned earlier is that to build an offshore wind turbine in the U.S., you need a foreign flag installation vessel capable of lifting up the components and installing them. And the reason for that is because there are none that are American. So you have to use a foreign one to avoid violating the Jones Act. You use a barge, transport the components from a port out there, then the foreign turbine installation vessel does the rest. This introduces huge complications. The New York Times had a story a few years ago stating that to build 2 offshore wind turbines as a demonstration project off the coast of Virginia, they had to operate out of Canada, because if they operate out of a U.S. port, it would violate the Jones Act. They said this took about a year. In Europe, it could have been done in a few weeks. So Dominion Energy, they decided, let's build a US-built wind turbine installation vessel. In Asia, that would cost $333 million. They said it would cost them $500 million. Well, that was in 2021. Now the price is up to $715 million, and it's still not complete. It was supposed to be finished by the end of 2023. We're now 2025, it's still not delivered. So this, again, is just a recurring theme. You mentioned the Maritime Security Program, which is something I actually support. For those unfamiliar, these are US flagged, US crewed vessels. They're built overseas, and the US government pays these vessels a stipend of $5-point-something million per year. In exchange for that, in time of war or national emergency, the government gets the right to grab that vessel and say, you need to transport equipment or supplies to wherever they're needed. I'm fine with that. For legitimate national security needs, by all means, let's have a US flagged, US crewed fleet, and let's pay for it, instead of forcing people like those in Puerto Rico, some of the poorest Americans, to pay these absurdly high transportation costs. That's not fair. It's not effective. That a small percentage of the country that has to use these ships is paying for national security. If this is truly about national security, we should all pay for it. We should do so efficiently and effectively, and the Jones Act gives us neither. So, thanks for your comment. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much for this has been a very enlightening subject matter. My name is Bruce Fry. I have lived in Hamilton Township locally all my life. In fact, I attended Stockton College back in the 70s, and I haven't been back here, but it's amazing to see what has transpired in the meantime. I guess you had asked about the wind, for someone to ask about the wind. I think you touched on it a little bit. So if there's currently there's a great debate about the price of electricity, residential electricity here in South Jersey. And I'm not sure the reason. There's been asked questions about investigations. I know that the BL England plant was closed down. It used to be fueled by coal, then oil. Natural gas was turned down. That was defeated. And now that plant no longer exists. So, I mean, the amount of questions that have popped into my head through this discussion have been, it just goes from one to the other. So is there any additional information or discussion on the Jones Act with the wind subject, the offshore wind, more than what you've discussed at this point?
Yeah, so with regard to offshore wind, again, I would discuss the inefficiencies that are introduced because you need these workarounds because we don't have a Jones Act compliant wind turbine installation vessel. And the one we do have is wildly overpriced and delayed, as per usual with U.S. shipbuilding. But I can speak to energy more broadly because, I mean, if there's one sector of the U.S. economy the Jones Act affects more than any other, it might be energy. I gave the example earlier of Hawaii buying oil from Libya instead of Texas. But it's not just a Hawaii thing. It's not just a Puerto Rico thing. The East Coast refineries get something like 80% of their oil from Africa and the Middle East instead of Texas. Because again, you factor in the cost of Jones Act shipping, it doesn't make sense to use it. It's not just the oil, it's the gasoline and other refined products, jet fuel, that the Northeast will bring it over from Europe instead of from the US refineries, because again, it doesn't make sense after you factor in the cost of transportation. California, the Los Angeles Times had an article just a few months ago noting that a refinery there is closing down. So where's the gas going to come from to replace the output of that refinery? Well, it said it might come from possibilities included the Netherlands, Singapore, Saudi Arabia. One place it would not come from, or very unlikely, would be the Gulf Coast. Even though it's substantially closer, again, you factor in the cost of shipping, it doesn't make any sense. And on the production side, the oil California uses, some of it's local, some of it comes from Alaska, but some of it also comes from Nigeria and other places and does not come from Texas because, again, it doesn't make sense after you factor in the cost of transportation. And we all pay the price. There was an academic study done, I think about a year ago or so, that calculated that just for East Coast consumers, The added energy costs were something like $746 million, as I have, and it wasn't even comprehensive, all energy types. It was a subset of energy types, motor gas, things like that, and just for one region of the country. Because ultimately, the Jones Act is a trade barrier to Americans doing business with other Americans. It tilts the playing field away from American businesses and towards foreign sources. I don't have a problem with imports. I'm a free trader, but I have no idea why U.S. policy should be putting American businesses on the back foot.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you for coming, guys. My name's Eric Dunn. I'm a doctor in the area. Lived here my whole life. This is for the senator. My understanding is 8% of all pharmaceuticals and medical devices in this country come from Puerto Rico. Is there a reverse effect from the Jones Act between, say, transportation of medical devices and other goods and services, goods really, I guess, from Puerto Rico back to America that adds to the cost of our medicines, medical devices, and things like that?
Likely, yeah.
And I'll add one other thing. I've been following Colin on Twitter. I call it Twitter for years, so nice finally meeting you.
I still call it Twitter, too. So nice to meet you.
Sorry, Senator.
No, I was going to say, if you're following Colin, everybody should follow Colin on Twitter. It's like a free class every day. It's a wonderful source of information and great data. So thank you, Colin, for what you're doing, and free advertising here for you. Yes, it makes our pharmaceutical products more expensive. Puerto Rico is home. Puerto Rico and New Jersey are very interconnected because we are both, a lot of the pharmaceutical companies have subsidiaries in Puerto Rico for many reasons. We can go over them, at another forum. But essentially, the goods that do go down to Puerto Rico, we pay more for them, and then when they're shipped back to the United States, then of course we're using the most expensive merchant marine fleet in the world. So it adds to the prices of those pharmaceutical products. Now I would add, a question to myself, which would be, what can we do about it? What can be done about it? And I think there are a whole bunch of states. If you talk to folks from Idaho or Iowa, and some of the more agricultural states of the union, they themselves are saying, why do we have this law? Let's get rid of this law. There's no reason why we should have this law. And I was just reading a few days ago that we're buying soybeans. North Carolina is buying soybeans. It's cheaper to get them to North Carolina from Brazil than to get soybeans through other freight mechanisms from Iowa. So it makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense what is happening in terms of the Jones Act right now. So I would say there has to be a coalition. There has to be, we have to slowly. Colin has been trying to put together a number of people. There are a number of senators who want to get rid of the law. I would say the transition that you have mentioned is the way to go. Don't do this overnight, sort of get rid of it. But the environment out there is very, very difficult. I will finish by saying, the one thing that puzzles me, and I'm taking this out of the Jones Act now, is that the U.S. economy has been fluctuating in terms of its unemployment from 3.8% to 4%. The U.S. economy has a full employment economy. Any economist would tell you that the U.S. economy is by far the strongest economy in the world. And yet, we still feel we have to sort of grab all of these protectionist measures because we cannot somehow compete with the world. We're beating the world. And I think by following these protectionist measures, I think we're defeating ourselves. And I think what we're going to be doing is actually making the U.S. less competitive when we're trying to make it more competitive at a time when the economy of the United States is in really good shape, by the way. That's my editorial for today.
All right, thank you. Tina, I guess it's basically 7:30. Do we have a closing comments? One more? Okay.
My name's Paul Gallagher, and my career either offshore wind either ended my career or was sort of the end of my career. I'm not sure which. But I'm no fan of the Jones Act. But Tim made a comment about the mom and pop shipyards. And there's a place called Yanks Marine down in Tuckahoe that makes magnificent vessels. They make all the ferries in New York. They're not building, in this international competition. But what happens to them if the Jones Act goes away? What happens to all those little mom and pop type shipyards up and down the coast that are making, 60, 70 foot vessels and scallop boats and fast ferries and those kind of vessels?
Yeah, we're not going to dive into that. What we're going to say is this. I think that is the realistic issue for, I think, the industry, 600,000, 700,000, 800,000 folks involved in the maritime industry. That's why I think you're seeing pushback and concerns, because a transition would be difficult, but I think Paul did a wonderful job laying out. How do you transition over time, as well as Colin? But I appreciate that from where I look. I'm from a maritime town, Norfolk. Yes, it's the largest Navy base. We have Huntington Ingalls there. We build nuclear aircraft carriers. We build submarines. But it's also an East Coast hub for sustainment of ships and for building smaller ships. And of course, as we said, barges and tugs are sort of the mainstay right now of moving our coastal economy. We have changed perhaps where we should be, but I think given the realistic environment that Paul did a good background of, I think what we've proven here is it's a very complex issue. Although it sounds simple, I mean, economically inefficient, unfair, yet it's incredibly complex, it's inefficient, it's bipartisan by definition, which is very strange in today's world. And I think, we have an opportunity now, at least from this perspective, to move forward a little bit. I think we're all educated a little greater than we were beforehand. And I think being sensitive to the impacts across the world, and unfortunately, the Caribbean will be hit again with a hurricane, whether it's this season coming up or the next. I live on the coast. We care about hurricanes every season. And the question is then what? Do we get a waiver? Do we not get a waiver? How do we justify a waiver? What's the impact? And how do we move forward? And how do we get to the point where we don't need to have waivers? And I think we'll see how this all plays out. But I do thank everybody for coming tonight. Tina, I thank, again, the Center for hosting this, and I think kind of a stretch.
I see Tina asking for one more question.
Yeah, we actually have one last question
Oh,
from
I
a
thought the
Stockton
last
University student.
Oh, wonderful.
Hi, I'm Christian. I'm from Atlantic County, and my question is for Camille. As mentioned before, you had heard about the Jones Act from AP US History, and I was wondering why you put an emphasis on learning it in high school rather than in college, despite being in political science with a concentration in international affairs. So I guess my question is basically, in your opinion, why is the Jones policy and similar policy education more firmly associated with historical education rather than international affairs and economic trade, despite it being so relevant in modern times?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it is an older law, one that we don't realize the impacts of it. I think that in a lot of our classes, we focus on more of like the now and the international organizations of international affairs, and not so much the domestic implications of what we do in the protectionism, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that's not as explored within maybe higher education even. There's more of an emphasis on it, I feel like, once you get to grad school or your higher level education classes within college, but it's not as much of a focus within the, like, when you're taking constitutional law or when you're taking other rights-based classes. Like I said, economics, education, and that part of it I feel like is often not as emphasized. There's less classes offered. It's kind of, I see as like a smaller offshoot that people don't really realize is there, but it's so important and so integral to every single law and every single thing that we do. But like I said, it just doesn't have the same emphasis currently. There's more of an emphasis on the actual like laws and human rights base.
Yeah, great question, and great, Camille, for that feedback.
Well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists for attending this evening. And for those of you watching at home, I would like to invite to the podium to say a few words on behalf of the Hughes family, William J. Hughes, Jr. Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists tonight, Admiral Sweeney and all of our panelists for a lively discussion. And I want to thank all of you. You know, you are living why my dad and my mom created this center. The purpose behind this center was to promote civility in politics and promote civil discourse on oftentimes controversial issues. There, in many circles, there is nothing, Colin knows this, there's nothing more controversial than getting a pro-Jones Act and an anti-Jones Act person in the same room. It is a battleground. But tonight we heard and learned more about the Jones Act. And might I say something else? And Senator Bottia knows this. Tonight you're going to walk out of this theater tonight knowing just about as much as your average Uber driver in San Juan, Puerto Rico knows. You can walk down and almost every citizen of Puerto Rico knows about and can talk to you intelligently about la ley de cabotage and the impacts that they have upon their life. So I thank you and consider this as you go out and talk to other people, because policies like this have a real impact upon people, and they have a real impact upon our country. Now, lastly, about the Hughes Center. I want to thank Tina and the Hughes Center for putting this on. And again, thank you for coming. We survive upon the support from the public, and we're able to put on programs such as this. So we ask you to support the Hughes Center in the future as we go on, both financially and coming to events like this. And to thank you and our panelists, we invite you to come to a small reception outside for some food and drink where we can talk about your views on this and other topics as well. Thank you very much and have a great evening.